hopefully.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Robert Elliott, Robert B. Barry Elliott. I prefer to be known as Barry, which is my middle name. Everyone has always called me that. We're here today to interview Al Meinhold, and he is a former teacher, junior high history, right, in Las Vegas.
I called it social studies,
Social studies.
which turned out to be almost anything you wanted to make it.
Yeah, we are at the library in Las Vegas, Nevada, West Charleston Library. This is going to go on my website. Okay, educationrevolutionnow.net, and it hopefully will go other places, Facebook, YouTube, wherever. We want to start a revolution in education, and we don't believe that school reform is possible. I hopefully am speaking for Al here too, but we'll get into all this. We have been trying to say for many years that all this recycled stuff that goes on is getting us nowhere, and we need something other than so-called reform. Education is not a race to the top or anywhere else. No Child Left Behind was a terrible fiasco, and we'll talk about these things. I've got some questions for Al that I'm going to read, and Al will do his best to answer, and we'll get into these issues. All right, Al.
You know, before we start with the questions, we ought to say something about myself, and that is that I've been away from the classroom for over 4 decades.
Well, that's okay.
So, you know, many of the comments I'm going to make in response to your questions may or may not be on point. So that's one thing. Secondly, I read voraciously and studied this stuff 4 decades ago, 50 years ago, and in the last few decades, you know, it's just superficial reading in that I do. So we got to caution anybody who might want to view this is that there could be errors made.
Well,
speaking for myself,
yeah,
with regard to statistics and everything else, you know.
Yeah. Well,
and yet I feel very strongly about what we're going to cover.
Right.
Go ahead, because I don't know what we're going to cover.
Well, we don't pretend to be experts, but Al is a scholar. He's devoted hours a day to reading for many years on many topics, and I've been working on this myself for 50 years now. And again, we are just doing our best to define issues and try to explain what needs to be done. Again, my thing is that I believe that the social media can be used now to motivate young people, students, college students, high school students, young parents, and others, professors, teachers, to start this revolution, which is going to be a whole new way of thinking about education and a new way of looking at schools, which I consider it at least to be beyond repair. My first question is, what did John Holt mean when he wrote or said school is bad for kids?
You mentioned John Holt?
Yes, yeah. John Holt.
Okay. Remember, among other handicaps here, I'm a little hearing impaired.
Right.
Yeah, John Holt. What did he mean? Well, you know, the literature, he had many books out. As a matter of fact, he even said more than that. He said school makes children servile and dumb. Now the problem is you're not going to get 1% of the American parents, no matter how badly the schools are treating their children. This is my view. You know, we share many views, but you're not going to get that many parents to accept that. And part of it is because a matter of definition, I suppose. What is servile and dumb?
Right.
Holt believed it. I met the man once. His books are well worth reading, even though he's dead 30 years, I think, or so.
Yeah.
But his books are well worth reading. How children feel, how children learn, what all I do on Monday. And, well, the list is, I can go off the top of my head and give a big bibliography that might be worthwhile later.
He was a
But
teacher, by the way.
he had taught. He
Oh,
had
yeah.
taught in various places. I've quite forgotten now all of his biographical detail, but he meant that when he said that. And the way you asked the question, it comes back to Ivan Illich. I've mentioned him many times to you, and deschooling society. And Illich had many things that we could do once we deschooled society. And yet one of my favorite gurus, Neil Postman, wrote an essay, challenged this view, not because he disagreed with what he said about the schools, but for many other reasons which seem to me to be valid. So I hope I'm not getting too far away from this question you asked me. Repeat that question again.
Well, I just wanted to
You
bring
mentioned
up-
John Holt, and how
yeah,
I
the
thought,
quote.
yeah.
Schools
Yeah,
bad for kids.
well, the last issue of the Saturday Evening Post, which got to go back to the 60s, I'm not talking about commemorative issues that
Right.
but when they published on a regular basis, they gave him the opinion piece in the pit, and it was, I guess that's the one that they captioned, schools make or school is bad for children, you know. Now, I don't know how many people we can convince of that, and if we could convince them, what would we offer?
Well, okay, that's one of my questions, of course, what do we offer, or what is the alternative? And that is one of the most common questions that's asked whenever we get into this issue of criticizing schools and saying that, that the reform is not happening, and so everybody says, well, if you want to totally give up on schools, then what are you going to do? And it's a major social problem and issue. And I have my own ideas about that, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, it's extraordinarily difficult to make any change, but reform, as you suggest, we've been hearing this stuff for, 100 years, or more. And you're familiar with the Lewis Lapham columns from 1989, when in the Harper's he printed that. He said, I've been hearing this stuff about reform for more years than he wants to think about.
Right.
And then, of course, the next one he had to respond to those people who are irate over what he was saying. But what he was saying, to me, made all the sense in the world. But they're simply not going to be reformed so long as they are doing what the society and the political economy wants them to do. I don't know how you're going to change that.
Well, again, the kids are there dealing with it every day. And that's my target audience, is to get to the kids.
That's
who
what
are-
I have problem with, getting to the kids to lead the revolt. These kids are, again, I'm using phrases that other men used 40 years ago or more, and they're very on the point as far as I'm concerned. These kids are conscript clientele. They can't do anything. How could they lead a revolt? They'd be slapped down so quickly, and they'd be failures, of course. So I think you're looking in the wrong direction for help in the changes that you want to be made.
Well, I don't think there's anywhere else that it can come from. I think it has to be them. Which again, we can differ on this, but and I'm thinking about the spring, Arab Spring, and the kind of things that we have seen because of social media. And if an idea has enough impetus among young people, especially within the whole society, at some point you build critical mass. So that's the way I believe we need to go.
Yeah, I know. We don't have many disagreements, but we have a disagreement there because I don't think we can or maybe should try to enlist the students themselves, the young people. These are young people between the age of 6 and 16. The only power they have is to sit there and ignore everything. Or to give the teacher some hard time, And some of them exercise that power.
Yeah. Oh,
Many
sure.
of them, many more now today than when I was in the classroom, I suspect, 40-some years ago, you know.
Yeah.
And then I see the response of the adult community. Well, boy, when I was in school,
Yeah.
I went home and the teacher scolded me. I'd get it twice as hard across the face or on. Nonsense.
Yeah.
Nonsense. Why would you want to do that? You're assuming that your kid is getting a good education? That's a pretty big assumption,
Yeah.
you know. And I'm sure you will get into that later, because the issue is, what is a good education? Or what is an education, for that matter?
That is another one of my questions. It's
Yeah.
number 3 here. How do you define education?
Well, I would define it much differently than I suspect most people who are very happily sending their kids off to school every day. Even when they fail, they think there's something wrong with their child.
Yeah.
That's dreadful. I think this is time to stick in a little personal thing that happened to me 30 years ago or so. I was 10 years or more out of teaching, and I went to one of the local diners, and the little lady behind, a sweet little lady, 20 years old, maybe 21 years old, she was the cashier. And she says, don't you remember me, Mr. Meinholm? I said, honey, I wish I could, but over the years I had hundreds and hundreds of students. She said, well, I was one of the bad ones. I said, I didn't have any bad ones, because I knew how she meant it. So I didn't have any bad ones. My point being, I hope I made the point, is from the time she was 13 or 14, they already had her convinced that she was one of the bad ones.
Right.
This happens far too often
Right.
in the school system,
Blaming
in
the
any
victim.
school system.
Blaming the victim is what it's called.
Well, yeah, well, of course, I wouldn't use that phrase in this context, but
Why
it
not?
is in effect that, you know. There's a lot worse things I suppose kids could be doing than going to school. And I know what one of your, well, we'll get to that later, because I'm sure it'll involve one of your questions.
Well,
But
I'm
I
sure
hate
you
the
get-
fact that school does more damage to many kids than it does any good.
Yeah.
Therefore, why compel them to go?
Right.
But if you don't compel them to go, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, again,
That's a big question.
right. Well, again, there's a lot of dropouts. I just heard last night, just switching channels on. I got the channel 10, the PBS channel, and they're talking about schools and education and the dropouts. And the number was 7,000 in Nevada, if I remember correctly, annually dropping out. And then nationally, of course, it's an incredible number. I forget the number.
Yeah, I'm
Millions.
bemused by some of these people who are alarmed by the dropout rate. In one breath, they're saying the schools are no good and they don't teach our kids. Well, it would seem logical then that the kid would drop out by the people who are critics of the schools, that they're not doing any good and they're not helping them. What would a intelligent 15, 16, 17-year-old do? I mean, what else could they? Well, I know what they do, because they have to. They go there and they sit there and they daydream. And incidentally, I'm one of those people who finds nothing wrong with daydreaming. You know, as a matter of fact, I think daydreaming should be a big part of education. We'll get around to that later, I assume, as to what is a good education, you know.
Well, what is a good education? Let's go there.
Well, you've heard me quote it before, and I think it will probably not resonate with I hope it will resonate with people who happen to be watching this. But in the novel published in 1947, John Horne Burns was the author. I remember some of this stuff, even though it's 50 years since I read it. And the one thing I didn't forget was how the book opens. It's a wealthy old dowager. It's in England. And it's a wealthy old dowager who is on her breathing her last, but she has a fortune, and she wants to put the fortune into a school. She wants to have a school established, and she says to the young man who's standing there, she says, "Education, boy, is not something to prepare you for life. That is a vulgar American error. It is something to take you out of life. Don't you want to have some small kingdom of your own that no one can take away from you?"